The House Committee on Oversight and Reform spent the day today grilling 4 former Twitter employees about the company's censorship policies and especially how those policies were applied in the weeks leading up to the 2020 presidential election. For more than 8 hours today, both Republican and Democratic members of that committee posed questions to former Chief Legal Counsel of Twitter, Vijaya Gadde, former Twitter Deputy Counsel, James Baker, who before that notably worked as the FBI's chief lawyer, Twitter's former head of trust and safety, Yoel Roth, that cultural leftist caricature, very familiar to viewers of this program, primarily for his starring role in the Twitter Files reporting, and former Twitter employee Anika Collier-Navarro, who Democrats were quite amusingly trying to herald as some sort of courageous whistleblower for her criticisms of Twitter that perfectly aligned with the standard left liberal desire for greater big tech censorship. In other words, she was there, this brave whistleblower, to keep telling committee Democrats that the problem with Twitter is not that it censors too much, but that it doesn't censor conservatives aggressively or frequently enough. Now, the context for this hearing, which we're so happy has finally arrived, is vital to understand. Like I said a couple minutes ago, I regard the decision, and it wasn't only by Twitter, but also by Facebook, to manipulate the ability of Americans to access critical reporting, not about Hunter Biden, but about Joe Biden, right before the 2020 election, was probably the single gravest example of weaponizing censorship in order to manipulate the outcome of elections, democratic elections, in at least the last several decades, if not ever. And there's all sorts of reasons why this ended up being such a serious matter, in part because it's illustrative of broader trends to attempt to convert the internet, the promise of which early on was that it would liberate all of us from centralized state and corporate control and would enable us to communicate freely with one another without the need to have this arbiter or this mediator being centralized in corporate and state power in between us, that we could communicate freely with our fellow citizens. Instead, it has become probably the most potent weapon yet for propagandizing a population, because instead of allowing this free and open inquiry that the internet was supposed to empower, instead it's now being used to censor any kind of views that are designed to challenge establishment orthodoxy. It's this one-way battering ram of messaging that perfectly aligns virtually always with the U.S. government, generally the U.S. security state specifically. And the fact that this was a case of 2 of the most important social media platforms doing exactly that, censoring, reporting right before the presidential election, days before, weeks before, a very hotly contested election. Joe Biden was certified as the winner of that election because he won 3 or 4 states by a very narrow margin of 70,000 or 80,000 votes, going a different way, and that election would have been certified differently. We will never know whether or not this impediment that was put into place to prevent Americans from learning about what turned out, everyone now acknowledges, except for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, everyone now acknowledges was true and authentic documents and true and authentic reporting, whether that would have made the difference. But whether it would have made the difference or not, the obvious attempt on the part of the intelligence community, then corporate media outlets, and then big tech to unite and keep this information away from American citizens, or at the very least, lead them to believe that it should be seen as discrediting based on the CIA lie that it was Russian disinformation, was undeniably a major escalation in the use of censorship in this country, and it deserves, at the very least, a few days of House hearings. Even though Democrats spent much of the day whining today that this is kind of some kind of a distraction from the things that really matter. Free speech really matters. A free press really matters. And the role that big tech is playing in our lives and in our democracy, and it's not just increasing ability, but it's increasing willingness to use that power to manipulate what we're hearing and what we're thinking on behalf of the political factions that it serves most loyally, cannot be minimized or dismissed, as Democrats spent the day doing, for obvious reason, namely that this censorship regime is constructed and is applied to benefit them. So of course they're happy with it. And one of the things that was real today, if you listen to any part of this hearing, let alone all of it as we did today, was that these 4 people who were brought before the committee to answer questions. 3 of them senior executives at Twitter, the other a low-level employee who is deemed to be a whistleblower. If you just listen to them at all, they're immediately recognizable. James Baker, who was the second in command to Vijaya Gadde as Deputy General Counsel of Twitter, who came from the FBI, where he was the chief lawyer of the FBI, now then suddenly at Twitter making decisions about our elections. He is very readily identifiable as someone who's from the U.S. security state, who hated Donald Trump for the reasons they all did, that he brought instability to their orthodoxies. And then Vijaya Gadde and Yoel Roth and this 4th person who was brought in as the whistleblower are just very standard left liberals. So we've shown you Yoel Roth at length before, the way he speaks, the things he says, how he thinks. It comes right out of left-wing academia. Vijaya Gadde is a little bit more sophisticated in her presentation, but there's no doubting the fact that she's just an establishment devotee to the Democratic Party. And then this 4th person was kind of a caricature, even more so than Yoel Roth, of a pro-censorship leftist looking at free speech as violence, believing that free speech constantly has to be weighed against safety. All of these new liberal left doctrines that have been invented in order to justify increasing control over the internet. Now, I think a timeline to remember here what happened is absolutely vital, because what has been done, and this is often the case, is there's an attempt to tell you these are really complex, this is a really complex series of events, that it's filled with all kinds of detailed complexities that can't really be discerned, and trying to get you basically to look away, to decide this is past history, there's no point in looking into this, none of it can ever really be resolved. And the truth is exactly the opposite. There's great clarity and simplicity to the timeline of what took place. So let's review that. First of all, the context for all of the 2020 election, and this isn't me saying this was a very lengthy article in Time magazine that was remarkably candid in acknowledging that virtually the entire American establishment was united to ensure Donald Trump's defeat in the 2020 election. They engaged in all kinds of maneuvers and all kinds of tactics that previously would have been unthinkable. The way in which they aligned across political ideologies and political parties to make sure that Donald Trump didn't get a second term was also highly unusual. Essentially, all of American power and institutions of power were on the same side in this election, something that normally doesn't happen in American elections. The Time magazine article was essentially describing what has now become the Sam Harris mentality. As you recall, Sam Harris, in a now notorious podcast, said that he believes that the censorship of this story, of the New York Post reporting, and anything that was done to ensure Donald Trump's defeat was justified. Censorship, lying, manipulation. He was honest enough to acknowledge what he thinks, which is that in his mind, Donald Trump is such a unique threat to the American way of life, such a singular evil, that by definition, anything that's done for the noble cause of ensuring his defeat was morally justifiable. A classic ends justify the means argument, even if the means in question are things like censorship, CIA interference in our elections, all things that are not supposed to happen in a healthy, normal democracy. To Sam Harris, he was expressing the view quite overtly that all of it was justified as long as it was done to stop Trump, and that was clearly the view of the establishment generally. They spent all year laying the groundwork for this, and then this specific case was an extension of that rotted mentality. On October 14th, just a little bit of 2 weeks more than... Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.